Welcome to another video. In today's video, we are going to be having a look at chapter 5 for the economic syllabus. So in this video, we will be having a look at living standards. We will be having a look at population, and then we're going to be having a look at poverty, and then finally we will be talking about the more developed and less developed economies. So that is the agenda for today's video, and I have done chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and I will be linking that in the description if you want to have a look at that. But if you've come just for chapter 5, this is the video covering that for IGCSE economics. So further ado, let's begin, and let's start off with living standards. So when you're talking about living standard, what comes to your mind? Living standards, right? So when we're talking about living standards, first thing that comes to your mind most likely would be your lifestyle. Okay, someone's lifestyle. And that's correct, because living standards, we basically have a look at the different lifestyles of someone in an economy, because it can change. Okay, not everyone has the same lifestyle. And when I'm talking about lifestyle, not what they do during the life, but actually when we're talking about their spending. Okay, because that's economics, right? We're not dealing with the rest of the factors, but we are focused on, are the people able to afford the necessities? Are people able to, afford the simple goods and services that are necessary for them? Okay, those are called needs. If we talked about that in the start, but yeah, those are called needs. So living standard, okay, when you're talking about living standard in economics, basically means someone's well-being, a person's well-being, okay, and all the factors actually that contribute to the well-being. Now this topic, the good thing about this topic is that it's quite general, okay, and if you've done geography, actually this topic is quite relevant. I mean, very relevant to you, because you must have already done it in geography, because it's quite almost the same, because we talk about living standards, we talk about poverty, which you do in geography, we talk about population, which you do in geography, you also talk about economies, which you do in geography. So okay, not that much, but yeah, okay. And also, if you don't do geography, these are like general knowledge types of stuff. Okay, like you should already know that poverty rate varies from country to country. There you go, you already know something from the topic. But regardless, you still have to do this syllabus, for the sake, because of course economics has its own terms that you need to have a look at. So living standards, what is living standards? Living standards refers to all the factors. Okay, this refers to all the factors that contribute to a person's well-being and happiness. Okay, that is what we mean by living standards. Now, how do you measure this? Okay, we call it we say something called GDP. Okay, and we've talked about this when we talk about economic growth. GDP, which means gross domestic profit, is the output in an economy. And how you calculate GDP per head is by doing the output, which is GDP, divided by the population. Okay, just like this formula is telling us. And that is how you calculate living standard. Okay, because first of all, look, GDP, you can also rewrite this in another way. GDP is the output, right? And that's the population. So if there is a greater, use of this output from the population, okay, meaning more people are buying these goods and services, hence more output, okay, that means the country is doing well in terms of living standards. Okay, not only is it doing well according to living standards, it's also doing well in economic growth, right? Because the more output, the better for the economy. We have talked about this in the previous chapter. Okay, not only that, but you can also say that because there's a lot of output, right, that means more people must have been employed, meaning the employment rates have been also high. If employment rates are high, that means people have income. Okay, if they have an income, what happens? Living standards increases. So you see, economics is like a chain. Okay, it all starts from the beginning, and the government, that's the good thing about macroeconomics, is because the government can actually get so many aims done with just a simple step. For example, if the government educates people, there's so many benefits. Okay, first benefit, people will get skills. Okay, this is a bit off topic, but you need to understand how we're coming to living standards, because living standards is really important in economics. We'll just have a look at why living standards is important for any economy and why, the government has to focus so much on this. But before we get to that, let's look at the stages of economics. Okay, so macroeconomics, we talk about the entire economy first of all. Okay, we talk about the entire economy. Second of all, we talk about government intervention. Okay, keep those two in mind: the government and the entire economy. Now watch this. The government, for example, one of the steps they can do is educate people. Okay, which is one of the biggest ones. And that's why, if you have noticed, in developed countries, education is so vital. And also later on this topic, you will get to know that countries have almost 100% literacy rate because education is really important. Okay, and that's the reason why most of the people actually, get educated, because it not only helps you but helps the economy greatly. Okay, because some people, may ask, like, why is education so important? Okay, but let me tell you why. Someone gets educated, okay, they acquire skills. So let's try to sketch this out. Where can I write? Okay, so I'll just write it on the side if possible. Yeah, so they get skills. Okay, from the skills, what happens? They will get a job. Okay, meaning they will be employed. If they get employed, that means they have income. Okay, meaning more income. You know what I mean? Okay, if they have more income, they will start spending more. Okay, if they start spending more, what happens? Living standard increases. Because remember, a living standard deals with someone's income, and if income increases, that means they can afford the normal, necessities in life, and that means their living standard will increase. So you see how, and all this, if you've noticed, is about the entire economy, not about one particular place. It talks about the entire economy. That's why it's a really important aspect. And living standards is almost like the end, because we talked about skills, didn't we? We talked about employment. Okay, we talked about employment. We talked about economic growth. Because when people get jobs, that means that the economic growth will increase. We talked about economic growth. We've talked about the benefits of economic growth. Okay, there's quite a lot of benefits. So macroeconomics is like a stage, if that's what you want to call it, and the government can do a lot to actually improve the economy, and living standards is one of them. Okay, this is like the second last stage, because we have one more stage, which is chapter 6, where we talk about international specialization. There is a whole new topic where, let's say your economy is not doing well. What are you going to do? Let's say, okay, I want to educate my economy, but I don't have the money. Okay, it's possible, and that's where the problem comes in. That's the factor that, separates one country from the other. Okay, it's that money there again. Okay, that's that ability to do something. But I guess that's what economics is, because in microeconomics, we talked about the ability of the consumer or producer. But in macroeconomics, we're talking about the government. So, it has its own perks. And with that being said, let's just focus on living standards. So, merits of using this GDP, because how you calculate this living standard is with the help of GDP. I've talked about what GDP is. GDP is simply, the output in the economy. And when I'm talking about output, I'm talking about goods, okay, in the economy. So if I take that output and divide with the population, I will get to know how much of that output is being used. Hence, I will know, is that output being used? If it is being used, that means people are able to afford those goods. That means they have a high living standard. Okay. Now, you might ask me, why is living standards that important? Okay. Now, again, it may not look that important, because, in the long term or the end of the day, what the government is looking for, is there enough jobs, right? Are we getting enough tax revenue? We are. Who cares? Okay, that's it. But not really, because living standards is quite important. Okay, but before going to why living standards are really important, we need to know how to measure this living standards, because how can we determine that this country has a high living standard, this has low? We need to get a systematic way of calculating this, and we use that way to and this way is actually called GDP per head. Okay, we use GDP per head to measure living standards. So how do we do this? So GDP is a useful measure of the total production that takes place in the country. Okay, and this will help, then will basically indicate the well-being of the economy. Okay, then the next thing you need to have a look at is that it also includes population, because for example, I've also talked about this when we had a look at economic growth. It doesn't mean that if a country is producing a lot of output, okay, it doesn't mean they have a high economic growth. It doesn't mean they are employed more. Not really, not a must. Okay, because you have to take consideration of the population, and that's why in economics we'll also have a look at population later, because population is a whole other topic. Okay, because population can really change how you view the country. Okay, and that's the reason why countries that are even smaller than China or India are more developed. Okay, the next thing why we use GDP is it's because it is calculated on output. GDP is output, as I said. And when you're calculating with output, it's a very good indicator that jobs are being created. Because the more the output, how does that, okay, now, how you can relate output with jobs is because, look, in order to make something, okay, in order to make a good, okay, you need that labor. Okay, you need people, you need men working for it, or you need people working for that certain product. Okay, and hence, jobs are created. And hence that is good for the economy, because if there are more employment, if there's more people working, what does that mean? People are getting an income. If they're getting an income, living standards increase. Okay, so that's a really good that's a really good reason why we use GDP. And finally, GDP data is readily available, so is population data. And that's why population is actually calculated from quite often, actually not that often, but it's actually calculated yearly, I believe. For countries, maybe not yearly, but mostly, yeah. Okay, so that is what you need to keep in mind. Now, limitations of using GDP. Now, GDP is a good way, but not everything about GDP per capita is good, meaning using the method of GDP to calculate living standards also has its disadvantages. And let's start off with the first one, because GDP is simply output of a population. It does not take into consideration the the person's income, okay, or where they're using their income. Okay, because if GDP is basically output of a population, but where these people are using that income is not a must to show living standards, because living standards is to show that you have enough money to live a life. But what if you can spend on goods, but you're spending on the wrong types of goods, like demerit goods? What if you're just earning the money just so that you can spend it on demerit goods? Is that good living standard? No, it's not. And you can have no count and you can have no way to measure this with the help of GDP. That's one disadvantage of GDP. Okay? Because you cannot see where these people are actually spending their money. Okay, so that is the first one. That is why GDP is actually one disadvantage. That's why we shouldn't use the method of GDP. The second method of GDP, okay, or second disadvantage, sorry, is that GDP does not take into consideration of the change in technology. Okay, because one thing that not all this output is actually made by people. Actually, most of the goods these days, because of technology, is actually made by a machine. Believe it or not, that actually I believe that these machines are replacing humans. Okay, and that's a really big threat to humanity, because the employment rates will fall, because we won't be needing the people, hence employment rates will really fall, and only the skilled will survive. So it's quite risky, but again, that's not for us to decide what the future brings to us. But for now, we just need to know that GDP does not take into consideration of technology. So some of that output in that formula might even be created by technology. So we don't know. The next thing is that the distribution of income is unequal. That means, for example, right, the rich people, they say the rich people get richer, the poor get poorer. Okay. That means, okay, from that GDP formula, it's not a must that the poor people are actually spending. What if the rich people have so much money they keep spending? Okay, but they are part of the population, so they're counted. Okay, so in that, it's not really accurate because some people might be very rich while some might be very poor. But the GDP will calculate average income. Okay, so if a country with really rich people, okay, and really poor, it will count the middle. Okay, that means it will not give the realistic value because your country may be really poor, but at the same time there are many rich people. So GDP really doesn't show the proportion, I'd say. The next thing you'd say is that real GDP excludes unpaid work people. That means people that do charities, voluntary organizations, and stuff like that. That understates total output, meaning output will fall because it's not taken into consideration in output. Okay, so that one is excluded. Okay, the next thing we say is that GDP also does not differentiate between the positive and the negative values of the economies. So that means that, for example, if in my country, okay, the output rises because of some sort of way, okay, then that means it will show the rise in GDP. But what if that output increases because of demerit goods, of alcohol, for example? Okay, because of that, the GDP will never know either their economy is positive or negative because the output may increase but at the wrong direction. So there's really no point because the living standards on the end of the day is declining. Okay, at the same time, there can be, for example, a natural disaster, okay, will make the output fall. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the living standard has actually fallen. Okay, it doesn't mean that living standards have fallen. At the same time, if the government spends on something, it does not mean the economy is increasing in their living standards. So you can see the flaws of GDP. So that's why I really like economics. It's because you have the advantages, you have the disadvantages, and it's you to choose which one you're doing. So it's like a analytic type of subject where you have to look at both sides. And these points that I'm having a look at right now can also help you in your discuss question when he talks about discuss whether GDP per head is a good way to measure living standards. Perfect. You can mention all this. The advantages, it takes into consideration of output, takes into consideration of population, it's readily available. But at the same time, the disadvantages, that we've talked about right now, that it calculates demerit goods, it will unequal income, it will also exclude unpaid work people, so on, so forth. So again, it has its disadvantages and advantages. Okay, so that being said, let's move on. Some other small topics that we have a look at, some other small factors, sorry, or small disadvantages, is that official GDP can be overstated because of technical errors. Of course, that is usually there because when you're calculating GDP, there can be some errors. Next thing you can say is that all that determines people's happiness and well-being, okay, is because GDP does not consider leisure activities, health, education levels, but instead it will consider just output in general, every output, even demerit goods. But that doesn't mean people are happy, right? So that's not that effective. The next one is that GDP per head needs to be converted to common currencies and adjusted to different purchasing powers in different countries. So that's another flaw. And it's not really converted, but it's just how much output does your country make? What's the population divided? That's your GDP. If their GDP is high, your living standards is high, something like that, right? Because when your calculation, for example, I have 50 million output over maybe a population of 5 million. Okay, 50 million, 5 million, what does that mean? One person, how much is one person making? Okay, we don't know that, but basically it works like that. Okay, so that means that it looks at the average income. Okay, and to calculate average income, we look at the output and we look at how much what is the total population. Okay, because why the reason why there's output is because there's demand in the economy, right? Okay, so that's the reason why we use output as a way to measure income. Okay, and then further to analyze living standards. We move on to a term called HDI. HDI is called Human Development Index, and this was actually introduced by the United Nations, and they use the HDI to compare living standards. Okay, and what the HDI consists of is they look at many measures, and they have assigned each country with a HDI from either 0, which is the lowest, to 1, which is the highest. Now, you don't need to know this for your IGCSEs, but this is just additional information actually. Okay, because HDI, you need to know HDI, but you don't need to actually know how they're allocated. So basically how the allocation works, it's a simple system actually. Okay, sorry, 0 to 1 is basically how they've classified each country. Simple method. Okay, 0 to 1, and then each country is classified according to their HDI. Now, when we're talking about HDI, okay, how we look at the measures, we look at different measures. The first measure we say is the income index. The income index is basically measured using the average. Okay, so let's highlight this. It is used with the average national income. Okay, and we use income to determine living standard. That's one of the measures. The second measure is education, because remember I told you education is really important. So that means we will measure how many years an average person has spent on education. If they spend more, that means their living standard increases. The next index we look at is called the healthcare index. The healthcare index is measured by the average life expectancy at birth. With these three indexes, we are basically able to classify whether a country has good living standards or bad living standards. Okay, with that being said, so we talked about GDP as one way to calculate living standard. The next way we're having a look at is HDI. Do we have a look at another one? No, we don't. So we only have a look at GDP and HDI as the two ways in the economics syllabus. So the next one, what are the benefits of HDI and the limitations? So let's start with the benefits. The benefits of using HDI is, first of all, it will take into account major indicators of living standards. Okay, major indicators, when we're talking about major indicators, is we're looking at the three factors. Health is really important. Education, as I told you, is really important. And finally, income. Those three itself is really major in the economy. The GDP does not have a look at education, does it? Okay, which was a disadvantage to that. Okay, the next one is that it recognizes that it is not just the output or income that determines living standards, because that is really important. It doesn't mean if you have more money you are actually happy. Does it mean? I don't know. I don't think, according to me, I don't think. Does it mean that if you have more money you're happy? It's quite debatable, I think. But instead, I don't think income can really just determine either someone's well-being. I don't think. It's not according to me, but you can have your own view. But according to me, you have to consider social factors. The social factors in this would be education and healthcare, because health is really important, because you may have a lot of money, but if you're unhealthy, there's no point. So the good thing about this is that it considers that, and also education is really important. It can be either you've got money from your inheritance or from your family, but does that mean you're your living standards have increased. No. So that's the good thing about HDI. It looks at the social factors. It looks at the major indicators. It also looks at the income determinants, and also looks at the social factors, which is really good. The next thing is that it is a useful method to compare global living standards, because I told you HDI is a system where it assigns a unit. So I can compare this country with this country, this country with this country, okay? And it shows clear patterns of either your living standard is increasing or decreasing, or so on and so forth, like that. Okay, so it's a very useful and reliable measure since it is produced by the UN. Okay, meaning it should be good, I guess. But yeah, so HDI is another way to measure living standards. We've talked about GDP, we've talked about HDI. But before closing up or having a conclusion of these two methods, let's have a look at the limitations of HDI, because again, in economics, with all the advantages comes the disadvantages, and it's you to decide which one is better. Okay, so limitations. And again, this one can come in a discuss question where it talks about discuss whether HDI is a good method to measure living standard. And here you would talk about advantages and disadvantages. If you don't know how to answer a discuss question, I have made a video just on discuss questions because they hold so many marks in the exams, and I think most of the paper 2 is just discuss questions. So have a look at that video, quite important, will help you get marks. But so limitations of HDI to compare living standards. So let's start off. The first one is that it combines a set of separate indicators into one. Okay, meaning this country might have really good health, really good education, but the income is very low. Okay, or you can say this country has very good health but bad education. Okay, it combines all these indicators. You don't know where the flaw is. Okay, so that's the problem there. The next one is that there are wide divergences of HDI within the countries. What this means is that it can really vary with country to country. Okay, because some countries, they have a good literacy rate, some not. So it really depends on the country. So it's not a systematic way to calculate something, because every country is different. Okay, they'll not have the same education, same health, this that. So it's not really a good way to measure. So hence you would say it has divergencies. And the next thing you can say is that the GNI, we talked about GNI. GNI is simply just the income. When we're talking about income does not say anything about inequalities, right? It just talks about income. It doesn't talk about inequality, does it? So that's another flaw. And then it does not consider the other factors like environmental quality, access to safe drinking water, stuff like that. Of course, it only has a look at very particular policies, which can be another disadvantage. At the same time, we talked about the advantages, saying that it's actually an advantage that they have taken into consideration of the social factors. But again, it's a disadvantage because they're only looking at 3 social factors. Okay, what about the environmental factors? What about political freedom, crime rates, stuff like that? Okay, so the HDI, also the next disadvantage is that the HDI information for all countries may not be available. Okay, how would you calculate health if your country doesn't even have hospitals, for example? It's kind of unfortunate, but it's the reality. So that is basically the methods of calculating living standards. Okay, that is all about the calculation of living standards. Okay, we move on to why living standards. Why does one country have high living standards, one has low? Or why does one country have a lot of income while one doesn't? Okay, so we have been discussing about the merits and limitations of using GDP per capita and HDI. Okay, but we will be discussing about this later on in the chapters. But for now, some other reasons is the following. The first one, difference in living standards within the country. Now, this is because the The HDI, okay, can be varied from country to country with the help of the methods that we have looked at. So that's quite self-explanatory, okay. The way we calculate HDI, we calculate for all countries, and that's why there can be a difference in living standards, because not every country has the same education, healthcare, income. Hence, of course, the value will be different, wouldn't it? It's not possible for one country to have the same rate of literacy rate, the same rate of healthcare, stuff like that. It's not possible. Not possible. Okay, and that's one reason why living standards can vary. Another way the living standards can vary is because of income and consumption. Okay, because this is a self-explanatory topic, because different regions have different incomes, and the different incomes are spent on different stuff. If I'm in a snowy country, I would spend on heaters and stuff like that, wouldn't I? Right? And hence, maybe living standards can be differed. Okay, or maybe in some countries you have the money, but the product is not there. Okay, meaning the output will technically fall, meaning the living standards do fall for that country. Okay, for example, they say in less developed countries, right, some of the resources are not really there. Okay, like basic necessities are not there. And you've seen those documentaries. I'm sure you've seen those documentaries where they talk about several countries that are starving, okay, dehydrated, stuff like that, and those basically talk about low living standards, because maybe they do have the money. Okay, I'm not saying they do, but they might have the money, but let's say they don't have the resources there. Okay, so I mean that can also contribute to living standards, I guess, because you really can't take into consideration each person's lifestyle, I guess, right? You have to look at it in terms of the entire economy. So those small exceptions are there, but the good thing about economics is that we look at the entire economy and we look at the average, no matter what. Okay, so with that being said, that's another reason why there can be differences. The next one is that major types of sectors, jobs, they can be different from place to place. One country can be onto agricultural stuff, one country can be into that. It can be different, hence can have different incomes. Okay, countries, for example, in Africa might have low income compared to countries in other, maybe because the government can actually provide for them. Unlike some other countries, right? So that can also determine living standards to fall or to differ. Local government provisions of education and health. Now the government cannot be, maybe it might not be that strong, hence maybe the living standards fall. Now, why is there this difference in living standards, right? Why is there a difference? Okay, the first thing you need to talk about is the productivity of industries. Now, some countries may be more productive than the others, hence the output can increase. That's the first one, quite self-explanatory. Wouldn't want to explain more on that. One country can produce more than the other, hence output increases, living standard increases. Next thing, major industries. Okay, when we're talking about like this, because of countries like Qatar and Norway, okay, they have so much petroleum. Okay, most of the income comes because of that, hence they'll have a higher living standard. So we talk about the major industries. The next one is population meaning dense population, lower income, but and put pressure on the scarce resources, because the more the population, that means more output. Okay, we need more output because people are demanding more people are demanding more, hence scarce resources. Okay, and that's why economics is really important, because in economics we talk about how to actually solve that problem of economic problem. I'm sure you know what economic problem is. Okay, and we have talked about this the early chapters, you should you know refresh your mind with that. But yeah, the other factors is the ability of citizens to pay taxes. Some actually don't pay taxes, they try to avoid taxes. Then we have the provision of health and educational facilities. Maybe you don't have those facilities. I've talked about this above, but maybe you don't have the facilities in your country. And then we have the variety of goods and services produced. If citizens can choose from a wide variety of products, living standards can rise. Okay, and then yeah, so like that point will go along with the point I previously said, meaning you might have the money but not the resource. That means living standards will fall, right? But if you have a wide variety of products, living standards will rise. Okay, the next one is war, crime, and natural disasters. Yeah, that one is self-explanatory. Some countries can have wars. That means their living standards fall because death rates increase. Okay, we move on to poverty. Poverty is not that big topic, but the term, poverty itself seems so broad. But in economics, I don't think it's that broad. And so is population. Population is a big topic, though. Population, as you guys can see, is a big topic. Big topic. Population is a big topic. Okay, but not poverty, not that much. Population, yeah. Okay, but let's start off with poverty. So we have two types of okay, first of all, what is poverty? Okay, poverty, when we're talking about the poverty, it is the lack of ability to afford basic necessities. Okay, that is called poverty. That is what poverty means. When you cannot afford the basic necessities, or you don't have the ability to afford these necessities, that is what we call poverty. We have two types of poverty. We have the absolute poverty, okay, right here, and we have the relative poverty. So what's the absolute poverty? The absolute poverty, we're talking about the inability to afford basic necessities to live. Now, the absolute poverty is complete basic necessities, like as simple as water. Okay, and then we have relative poverty. Okay, relative poverty, on the other hand, okay, is the condition where you have fewer resources than others in the same society, meaning you're not that, you're not in the extreme case, but you have fewer resources than others in that same society. Okay, that's the main difference between the two. Now, why does poverty occur? Why is poverty really important? First of all, poverty can occur from various ways. The first one and the most biggest one is unemployment. If you are not employed, you will not get that income. If you don't have the income, you cannot spend on those basic necessities. Poverty. Next one, another big topic, low education levels. Now, this is the reason why we talk about education, employment, stuff like that. Low education means they don't have the skills. They don't have the skills. They don't have jobs. They don't have jobs. Poverty. Okay, I'm summarizing this because it's quite obvious actually. Unemployment is poverty. Poverty is a general knowledge type of topic, so I'm not going to spend so much time on this to help you understand. Just read through all this. Okay, so the size of the family. If you have a big family, you have to split your money, right? Poverty. Okay, quite explanatory. That's why I am really not emphasizing so much on this. Next one, age. Older people, they can be less productive, hence they cannot be able to find jobs, hence may be poor. And then we have the young people who are that hype of gaining money, hence they will have more higher income. But again, the old people, sorry, will have a lower income. The next one is poor government support. So when we're talking about poor government support, the government does not give them, those pension schemes, those welfare schemes, those unemployment benefits. All that will actually lead to poverty. The next one is poor health. That means that if you are living in a place where you don't even have shelter, poor health, so that you have to put so much money into your health that you won't be able to recover, and you will always be in poverty. Actually, they say that healthcare is really dangerous because if you get a sickness, right, it can wipe out your entire income. So it's quite dangerous out there, and even the most richest on one day can become the most poorest. because of health. So health is a really big factor. That's why in countries where so many diseases are there, if you've noticed, have a very high poverty rate. Like in Africa, if you've noticed, they have a lot of diseases, and hence I think that's one of the reasons why there's high poverty, and also their government is not that strong. I think that's my reason, but you may have your own reason. Then there's overpopulation. Overpopulation is maybe because people don't have enough money, to afford those contraceptives, or maybe it is because people actually are willing to increase their family size so that they can have human labor. That can be one reason. And overpopulation, and basically means you have to feed your family, and hence income is split to like 10 people if you have a big family. So yeah. Then we have the migrants. So people that have the migrants will always they won't be like accepted in the society, hence will remain in poverty, I guess, because they won't be able to find jobs and stuff like that, so on and so forth. And then we have gender, because women face discrimination. We've talked about this when talking about the determinants of labor. So I think this is related to the determinants of labor. If I think a bit, right? It's a bit related to the so-called factors of or determinants of labor. I think so, right? Yeah. That being said, that is all the causes of poverty. Let's talk about the policies, because poverty is actually really bad for the economy. Because having such a when we talked about employment, right, we talked about the disadvantages. It's literally the same here. So all those disadvantages applies to poverty, because people who are poor, mostly they are not employed. Because if they're employed, I don't think they would be categorized in the population of poverty. I think so, but yeah. So yeah, that is the policies to what are the policies to evaluate poverty. The first one is to introduce the reduce unemployment. That basically means if you do measures that doesn't favor unemployment, okay, then your poverty will reduce. Also, you can use something called expansionary fiscal policy and monetary policy, which we have looked at. Fiscal policy talks about government spending. So when we talk about government spending, we can talk about investing into education. Okay, that will help reduce unemployment. Then impose progressive tax. This basically means income taxes are progressive. That means the burden on the poor people is not that high, meaning they have extra income to spend on other stuff. The next one is the welfare services. That this only works if your government is actually really rich. So or really they're able to do this. But in most of these countries, right, that have a high poverty rate, their government itself cannot provide this, which is sad, but it's the reality, I guess. Okay, so to stop poverty will become really hard, but we'll see. Okay, later on you will understand more about this. Then we have introduced the minimum wage legislation. This basically means people who are hiring or employing, they have to have a minimum wage. The next one is the increase the quantity and quality of education. So we talked about this. This is sort of related to the fiscal policy, because you can spend on education, I guess. Okay, and that will eventually help reduce poverty. Attract and invite inward investments. Okay, so you're attracting inward investments. That means more investments from abroad will help to create jobs, create income, to reduce poverty over the time. And finally, overseas aid. Overseas aid means we will get help from agencies. Okay, and one of the examples is the United Nations. United Nations is here to help, right? So they help with countries that are poor. And then also the governments from outside your country can actually help you. And the reason they help you is they give this in terms of loan, so meaning the country has to pay back. But usually these loans are quite nominal, and they usually say give me like 50 years to pay that loan back. So that's why every country usually takes that loan, and that's what we mean by overseas aid. We move on to population, a quite big topic. It's a not bad big topic though. And when we're talking about population, it's again general knowledge, right? We've done this in geography, if you do geography, and population is just on its own, right? So population, what do you understand by population? Population is the number of people in a specific area. So the number of people inhabiting in a specific area, that's the definition of population. Yeah, that's population basically. Number of people. Number of people inhabiting in a specific area. So what are the factors that affect this population? Now, one of the factors is birth rates. Again, big factor. Birth rates, and then there's also death rates. So birth rates, when we're talking about birth rates, we're talking about the average number of children born in a country each year compared to the total population of an economy. This is what we call birth rate. So basically, how many people are being born per year. Okay, and this is usually expressed, again, if you do geography, you know already this definition is exactly the same, nothing different in economics, and this is usually calculated over every 1,000 people in the population. Now, why do different countries have different birth rates? Let's start. This is general knowledge again. First of all, living standards. Okay, if people are educated of the use of contraceptives, the use of birth control, stuff like that, right, or the use of pregnancy stuff and all related to stuff like that, then the birth rate can be controlled. Okay, secondly is that if you improve the quality and the availability of the food, right, then the babies will be more healthy, and hence the chances of the baby dying is quite low. The next one is the contraception. What this means is the increased use of contraception and abortion have been reduced birth rates. So this would only help in developed countries, because actually, a matter of fact, undeveloped countries don't have the access to contraceptions and abortion pills and so on and so forth. Hence the population just keeps rising, and that's why if you notice, less developed countries, they have such big families because they're not able to afford these contraceptions. The next one is the customs and religion. Okay, so many religious beliefs say that you don't use contraceptives, you don't use pills, you don't use this, so on and so forth. And actually, it says that if you have a large family, you're so-called fashionable, I guess. Okay, so that's culture, I guess. But yeah, that's also one of the reasons why there can be high population. We have the changes in female employment. That means more females will lead to less birth rates. Okay, because they don't want motherhood to break their careers. They want to focus more on their careers. Hence, they are not willing to raise a family, I guess. Okay, so that's all factors. Not all does this apply actually, but you have to talk about this when talking about birth rates. The next one is marriage. Some developed countries actually tend to marry later, and hence their birth rates do decrease, because usually in these countries they do get babies after getting married. Okay, so hence the birth rate can reduce. We then talk about death rates. Death rates is another factor that is actually determines population. Now you can see I'm rushing towards this because it's not really that big of a topic. It's quite straightforward, right? Birth rate, how many people are getting born. Death rates, how many people are dying, right? Factors affecting this, stuff like that. So death rates, the number of people who die each year compared to every 1,000 people. Almost same to birth rate, but instead of people getting born, people are dying. What are the reasons for differing death rates in the different economies? The first one is living standards. So in here we talk about the availability of food. If food is not that quite available, people will die faster. They'll have get malnutrition and so forth like that. That will be high death rates. Medical advances, again, this does link with living standards, because countries that have availability of the hospitals and stuff like that and healthcare, they will have less chances of dying. And then finally, we have natural disasters. Countries like Japan and stuff like that, where so many earthquakes happen there, it's quite hard to actually control the population size in terms of death rates, because so many people die from the natural disasters. And then there's also the disadvantage of droughts in African countries, where they don't get enough water, hence they get malnutrition, and they do die from dehydration. So those are all factors that affect death rates. Another factor that affects population is called net immigration. Net immigration is the difference between immigration and emigration. Immigration is when you're entering the country. Emigration is when you're leaving the country. Just bring that in. Okay, so immigration is people entering, emigration is people leaving. The net inward immigration will increase the working population, so meaning people more entering into your country will increase employment, leaving less employment. Why is there a difference in the net immigration? Okay, it's first one, living standard. People want to move into countries that will help them in the future, hence they will shift there. The next one is employment opportunities. So people usually shift to different countries according to the capabilities of the employment opportunities. That's one reason, quite self-explanatory. Then we have climate. Okay, so when we're talking about climates, actually people do consider this. That means that countries that are very cold, very hot, they don't shift into those places. Let's talk about population structure. Okay, when we're talking about population structure, we're talking about age distribution. We've talked about this because when we talked about labor, right, when we were talking about the determinants of labor, we talked about this. First one, age distribution. We look at the number of people. Okay, so in your age, basically it comes in this name, right? Age distribution, the number of people in each age group, and the consequences of an aging population. This can actually come in a discuss question, so you need to know this. Now, what's the consequences? First of all, the workforce will decline, and hence there'll be too much dependence on the tax-paying population. The next one is there will be increase in demand for products for old people. The next one, government will have to spend more on welfare schemes, pension schemes, stuff like that. And then old people are less mobile, and productivity or stuff like that will be slow to adapt to these new technologies, which is a consequence again. But again, there's also advantages because aging populations, they are more skilled. They know what they're doing, right? And because they've been in the thing for quite long. Okay, but their disadvantage can be they cannot be that productive, right? Hence, output levels may fall. Then we have the gender distribution, the balance of males and females. You have a look at that, the sex ratio basically. And your main motive in the economy is to have gender balance, and the economy tries to have a gender balance. But again, there can be many other factors. For example, wars can kill many males, and then we have the violence towards the females, which is also another way to actually a reason why there can be gender imbalance. And then we have more of sex-specific immigration. That means more males immigrate to a country looking for work. That can be, some because maybe some males doing particular jobs go to a specific country for that. And then some females will encourage birth rates in some particular places. For example, they can go to their hometown just to deliver a baby, for example. And then more females in the employment will increase the productivity. More females in education and employment will increase living standards. Population pyramids. This shows again the age and gender distribution. So age and gender. So the previous one was just gender and then age. Now we have the population pyramids, which show both of them. It's quite self-explanatory. We have the females, we have the males, and then we have the ages, where it talks about the population size of each of the following. Then we have the geographic distribution. And when we're talking about geographic distribution, we're talking about where most of the people live. Okay, and hence, populated places, they have a pressure of scarce resources, so you have to take into consideration of all of that. We have the occupational distribution, coming from its name, occupational, meaning the people who are working at a particular place. Okay, for example, in the less developed countries, right, they will focus more on agriculture, hence maybe the population can be more dense to the agricultural side, so you need to have a look at all of that. When we're talking about an optimal population, this is when the output of the goods and services per head of the population is maximized. This is what we call optimal population. And how can we affect, or what are the effects of an increase in the population size? Let's see. How can the population size increase, decrease, stuff like that? What are the effects of an increase? So if your country is increasing population day by day, what are the effects? Is it good? Is it bad? Let's see. First of all, increase in size of home market, meaning more demand because more people, right? Next, economic growth, because more people available for working, higher economic growth. Next one, increased supply of labor, because more people are there, more people will be willing to work, hence increase in supply of labor. It will put pressure into scarce resources. More people will mean more resources needed because there's more demand, especially land, meaning people living there. More capital goods, meaning machinery, will be used because you have to satisfy everyone in a short period of time. We'll have a fall in productivity because if too many people are working on limited resources, there'll be low productivity. We do have the shift in employment from the primary sector towards the services sector. That means more people will move on to the services sector because maybe primary activities, because of scarce resources, are so finite that people would just start moving on to service sectors. And then finally, we have the congestion, which is a big problem because this actually links with scarce resources because of, like land, but basically because of a rising population, there will be a lot of congestion in urban cities, leading to the negative externalities, I guess. Okay, because there will be pollution, there will be heavy transport and stuff like that. So here was a question where we're talking about discuss whether the aging population benefits the economy. The notes will be down in the description. If you want to have a look at this at your own time, you can. I made a video just on discuss questions, so you can have a look at that. But in this video, we are only looking at the theory part and not quite this part. Okay, finally, the last topic where we talk about developed and less developed economies. So economies can either be developed, can be less developed. Okay, there's two ways. Okay, now we have again different types of development. So let's have a look at this. We have the first one, the economic development. When we're talking about economic development, we are referring to the increase in the economic welfare of people through the growth and productive scale and wealth of an economy. So governments aim for their countries to expand from developing economies to developed economies. Okay, so how you do this is by increasing the economic welfare of people. So in terms of living standards, I believe, and lifestyle, basically make people more productive, have higher incomes. That is called economic development. We have something called developed countries. I'm sure you've heard of this. Developed countries is when they have high GDP per capita, high life expectancy, high literacy rate, and stuff like that. All the factors that we talked above previously. The next one, we have the underdeveloped economies. When we're talking about this is the opposite of developed countries, meaning they have low GDP, high population growth, poor infrastructure, so on and so forth. Quite self-explanatory. It's just the opposite of developed countries. When we have the developing economies, these are the types of economies, if you haven't realized by now. So developing economies is when they're getting there, okay, meaning it's improving from every day by day, meaning their GDP is improving, their population size is improving, their infrastructure is improving, healthcare, education is improving. That means they're developing economies, but they're still classified as having a low standard of living. Okay, but again, it's getting better over time, so eventually, hopefully, they become developed countries. Now, what are the reasons for low economic development? Low economic development. Economic development refers to basically the lifestyle from place to place. That means we are looking at the living standards, basically, okay, from place to place. Now, how can this be deferred? First of all, over dependence on agriculture. So poor countries, they focus on their resources because they can get a lot of development from there because that can suffice enough. We then have the domination of international trade. What this basically means is that rich countries, okay, will basically pay domestic producers to increase global supply. Okay, so poor economies will not be able to compete with these prices, and hence they will lose their jobs and income and stuff like that. So what this basically means, the wealthier developed economies will put so high prices, poor countries won't be able to afford this basic necessity products, because not all products are actually found within their country. Okay, so that's reasons of low economic development. We have low levels of saving. It's quite explanatory, because they'll have low incomes in these types of countries. Then there'll be lack of capital. More of it will be man-made. If you've noticed, the poor countries, they don't have machines, but more of they do have more labor. They're more labor intensive. Then we have the poor investment in the infrastructure. So that basically means the good infrastructure in transport, health, education essential for development, but in this case they don't have all that. Then we have the high population growth. This basically means because of high birth rates, and this is all happens in less developed countries. We have the war conflicts with these low economic development countries. There can be war, can be conflicts, hence maybe the development is actually stuck there, meaning they can't become developed if they have wars and conflicts. And then we have corrupt governments that they don't care about the welfare of the economy, but instead they just care about their own income. And that means they're unstable governments. So that usually happens with countries that are poor. Okay, and finally we talk about some development indicators are used to measure how developed an economy is. GDP per capita and population living on less than $1 a day. So believe it or not, some people live living on less than $1 a day. So with that being said, we have talked about population, we've talked about living standards, we've talked about poverty, we've talked about the different developments, economic developments of countries that are developed and countries that are not developed. So that marks the end of today's video, and hopefully you have understood something. Hopefully you have got something out of this video. Thank you for watching this video. If you haven't watched the other chapters, I would advise you to watch those chapters, and chapter 6 will be on its way. Sorry for the slow uploadings, but hopefully we will get back on to track. And with that being said, see you in the next video. Goodbye.